with object and classes, and in exercise 1 we spoke about creating an interface class. That was the button class that we had a look at. In this exercise we're going to show you how to create an entity class and how to use it. I've already created a form with a button and very simple program, and that is when we click on the button we want objects to be created. Okay, the first thing I'm going to show you is how to create a class in Visual Studio C#. So you're going to click on project, go to add class, and then we give it a name. Okay, now I've already created a student class, so let's call this some other class. Typical entity class can be something like student, where you have certain data members like name, address, and so on, or it can be transactions, or it can be payments, or it can be movies, or anything that of which you want certain data to be stored, as well as defining certain methods. So let's just call this one payment, just for illustration's sake. You see then the next screen is where you see class payment. Now in a class we're typically going to define data members, then we're going to define constructors, then we can define all kinds of other methods. A constructor is a kind of a method. Other methods are methods that you define that is particular to payment, certain actions that you want to be performed on such data members. And then lastly, we look at properties, which I will explain in a minute. Something else I want to show you or point out is that if you do not have any access modifier in front of the word class, it assumes that it's private. It means that only the elements inside this class can have access to the methods and so on. So we want to make it public because eventually we want other classes to have access to this class as well. Okay, so that is an example. Now I've already created the student class. Now let me just show you those typical components that I've just mentioned. So here we have data members. Now we've decided to, and this is up to you how you want to define your class, but we've defined 3 data members. That is the data, and they are all private. So we want to keep the data private of a class because we want to protect it. I will show you in a minute how you will get access to it. The next component is the constructors. Here we have defined 2 constructors. It has the same name as the class. In this one it doesn't receive any parameter. All that it does is the moment you declare an object and when you instantiate it, you always call a constructor. And you can define it in different ways. In this case, if you just call the constructor without any parameters, it will initialize the data members to these values. If you call this constructor, it has the same name, but can you see here we have 1, 2, 3 parameters. Then you give the full name, student number, and mark, and those values will be assigned to the data member. Okay. Then the next one is a method. Now you can have more than one method. In this case we've just defined a method which we call has passed. It doesn't receive any parameters. It is not void, non-void, so it returns a boolean, and it works in this way. If the average mark, with other words the data member average mark, is greater or equal than 50, the value that is returned is true, else it's false. And lastly, we define the properties, and it's through the properties that other classes get access to the data members of a class. It has the same name as the data members. Okay, there are 3 properties. Also a kind of a method. And maybe I should just point out again, that's why the data member has a small m in front of it. Just to remind yourself that this is a data member, whereas this is a property. How does it work? It has 2 parts. The one is getting the value of mname, and the other one is setting it. And we will explain how it works. And that is, you have one for each data member. Okay, now we have the class. So we've just defined the class, we made it public, so the other classes will get access to it. All right. Now, how does one use a class? Now, let's go back to the form. As I've said, I've already created a button, and we want to create, let's say, 3 objects. And we want, and remember, an object is an instantiation of the class. Now, what is the class? It's almost like a blueprint. It says that any object in the class student will have 3 data members. So it's 3 pieces of data, namely a name, a student number, and average mark. You can also use a method associated with an object to get to know whether the average mark is greater or equal to 50. All right, so now again, I've already created 3 objects. The first one is create object called my student 1 of class student. So what's the code like? So you say student, okay, that is, with other words, it says that's the class. Then you give a name that you think up yourself for your first object that you want to create of that class, and you use the code new student. Now look at this one here. Here you're calling the constructor that's not accepting any parameters. Let's go back to our student class just to go and have a look again at what that constructor will do. So it means that at that point, the values, the data members of your object will be no name, 0, and 0. That's what it says. Okay. But we don't want that, so we said no, rather make the name, the data member, mname, make it John Smith. But look at this. Here we call the property. Here we use the property of the object name, student number, and average mark. Let's go back to student. What we're doing here is we're using these properties. With other words, we're using this part of the property. We are setting the value of mname to John Smith. We are setting the value of student number to whatever it was. I can't remember now. Okay, it was 201002. And that we do 3 times because we want to create 3 objects for 3 different real students. So remember, the student class is an abstract blueprint of a typical student. The moment you create objects, they become instantiations of the class. So it's a real person for which data you want to store. Okay. Right, now when we click on this button, we want to make sure that the students or the objects were actually created. So just to give us some kind of feedback, we say messagebox.show, and we say go and student one dot name. Okay. And we say that for each one of them. My student 2.name and the last one. Name. Okay. Now, can you see here we use the property name again, just like we've used it there, but we use it in a different way. here we were setting the value, and here we are getting it. Okay, let's go back to the student. Can you see you have two parts for each of the properties, a get part and a set part. Right, so now let's see what happens when this program runs. Okay, if we create students, John Smith, Susna Jara, and Sonia Jordan. So those three objects were created. Okay. Now, at this point, what we've done is we use the constructor with no parameters, and then after that we set those values to John Smith, Susna Jara, and so on. Now, instead of that, so I'm going to comment that out. You can use the other constructor. Let's go back to that one. Now, this constructor accepts specific values and it sets the data members to those values. So we can rather use that. So the code for that is student, my student 1. So here I'm creating the object, is new student, but now I give those values. Ron Smith 201 002 and 34. It's not really important what the values are. It's as long as you get the idea. Student, my student 2 equal new student. Here I'm sending now these values to the constructor. It is Susna Jara 201022 and 50. And then the last one, okay, so these three lines of code do exactly the same as all these lines. The only difference is I'm using another constructor. So let's see if we get the same result. Yes, we get the same result. Yes, and that's it.